Yes, great. Okay, so everyone can see the presentation mode now. Right, so my talk is called Thinking in Pictures or Blind Mind's Eye, the Experience of Mental Imagery and Imagery Extremes in Autism. So just jumping into it, my name is Dr. Vishayan Reader. I am a lecturer in psychology at the University of Liverpool. And my research is broadly it encompasses a lot of aspects of mental imagery, which I'll go into the definition of in just a moment. But all of my research is involved in the role of mental imagery in things like mental health, neurodivergence, of course, perception, including visual perception, and of course, individual differences and how that affects how we experience the world. And I just wanted to let you all know that if you're interested in this topic, feel free to email me at any time. I have my email address, which is going to be in the bottom of the screen for the whole presentation. You can also sign up for my research database if you want to be contacted for research studies that are related to this. And also, if you want to learn more about me, you can visit my website, which is rashanreader.com, and you can learn more about some of the projects I'm doing. So what is mental imagery? It's usually defined as the mind's eye. And usually when I ask people to discuss their own personal experience of mental imagery, it's very effective to ask them to imagine a sunset. So a sunset is an extremely visual experience, right? It's the only way we can experience a sunset is dominantly visual. So I ask people to imagine and describe a sunset from their imagination. And there's many different ways that people can experience a sunset. So some people might have this sort of experience where they have some color and they have sort of this half circle coming down below a horizon. And for some reason, oftentimes when I ask people to imagine a sunset, they usually imagine it setting over a sea or an ocean for some reason, or on the beach. So this is a very sort of typical imagery experience where people can describe some shape and colors and maybe some sort of meaningful objects as part of the sunset. But what we know now as researchers is that there is a spectrum of mental imagery abilities, which ranges from absolutely no imagery whatsoever to extremely vivid and realistic imagery. So I'm going to explain the spectrum using this sort of cartoony sun as a middle ground of the spectrum. So this can obviously be more vivid in people's imagination. So if I ask you to imagine a sunset, some people will have lots of different colors in their mind's eye. They might have some ripples or maybe even a bit of beach in their visual experience of this. And it can become even more detailed, maybe with clouds or stars or trees. But then at the very highest end of the spectrum of imagery is the experience that is as vivid and realistic as actual seeing. So some people can have an image in their mind's eye that is really almost like a photograph in their mind. And so what we know now about the spectrum is that sort of from this moderate to sort of cartoony, vivid, but not quite realistic imagery, that's all considered the typical imagery part of the spectrum. And then at the very highest end, the photograph-like mental imagery, that's called hyperphantasia. And then, of course, there's the lower end of the imagery spectrum. So some people's mental imagery is very faint or vague. It might not have much color. It might have a little bit of shape information. Some is mainly spatial. So people might have an idea that, okay, there's some kind of horizon that I have to be imagining and sort of a half circle for the sun, but it's extremely basic. And then at the very lowest end of the spectrum is it's really just abstract thoughts about the sunset. So you might think, well, yeah, the sun should be above the water in this case. But in terms of visualization, it's really a black box. There's absolutely nothing in terms of visualization when they're asked to imagine the sunset. So now, in the most recent research, we're calling this sort of vague and dim imagery hypophantasia, which is very low imagery. And then the absolute lowest end of the spectrum is called aphantasia. So this is the full spectrum, and a lot of more recent research is starting to categorize people into these four sort of groups. But just to keep in mind, the early research on individual differences in mental imagery would usually split people into just two broad categories of sort of absent or vague imagery versus typical or vivid imagery. So different studies have used different criteria and different groupings, which can also affect results in research. But most recently, and this is the categorization that I use in my research as well. And there can be very important differences between these different categories as well. So I'm going to talk about mainly the extremes here. So aphantasia and hyperphantasia are called the imagery extremes, which is the blind mind's eye and thinking in pictures. And you might have heard these terms already because oftentimes these terms are associated with autism. So in the 90s, and I don't know how much people agree with this anymore, but Simon Baron-Cohen and colleagues used to say that impoverished imagination was part of the diagnosis of autism. And I think it's been more nuanced more recently, that it's social imagination that is impoverished. But at the time, they were saying that all imagination is impoverished. And this is also reflected in the autism spectrum quotient, which you may be familiar with. It's a questionnaire where you rate your agreement with a series of statements that are supposed to encapsulate autistic characteristics. And there's quite a few items on the AQ that relate to mental imagery. So if I try to imagine something, I find it very easy to create a picture in my mind. Or when I'm reading a story, I can easily imagine what the characters might look like. That doesn't sound very social to me. It sounds mostly like pure imagery. And these things contribute to people's scores on this questionnaire. So since the 90s, there has been this sort of association between low imagery and autism. However, on the other end, we do have some very famous anecdotes that a lot of people with autism can think in pictures. So Temple Grandin, for example, has a whole book called Thinking in Pictures, where basically she ascribed her autism to her ability to think always in pictures, purely visual. And there is some research to support this. In 2010, Kunda and Goel said, a subset of individuals on the autism spectrum exhibits a disposition towards using visual mental representations. So it has been known for a while that there do seem to be these extremes within autism. But something to keep in mind is that aphantasia and hyperphantasia as terms have only been coined very recently after most of these studies in autism were done. So what I'm going to present now is some of the research that's been done on the relationship between mental imagery and autism since aphantasia and hyperphantasia have been defined. So first, some of the evidence for an association between aphantasia and autism, so the absence of imagery in autism. This paper came out in 2021. It's called What's the Relationship Between Aphantasia, Synesthesia, and Autism? Synesthesia is a perceptual characteristic that I'm not going to go into. But what they did was they recruited 118 people with aphantasia and also low imagery, hypophantasia, and another group with a typical imagery and hyperphantasia. They lumped them into these two separate groups. And they matched them for age and gender. So basically, they had a similar distribution of age and gender within both groups, because this can also affect imagery. And then they gave them all the autism spectrum quotient, in which scores greater than or equal to 32 indicate a possible presence of autism. And what the authors found was that here you can see on the vertical axis the average overall score on the AQ. And then you can see that there is a difference between the aphantasia group and the control group. But something to keep in mind is that this average comes nowhere near the cutoff for possible presence of autism. So it was important to find out whether it's just a slight variation that's not really meaningful, or if there are actually more people with a possible presence of autism among the aphantasia group. So the next analysis that they did was they split people up into those who had AQ scores above this threshold and below this threshold. And they found that about 20% of people from the aphantasia group had scores above this possible presence of autism threshold. And this is compared to the control group, which is more close, at least closer to the general population prevalence. So at least in this study, the authors found that about 20% of aphantasics have possible presence of autism. In another study that was published just last year, this one was called Aphantasia and Autism, an investigation of mental imagery vividness. They recruited 55 individuals who were diagnosed with autism and 19 self-identifying individuals as autistic, and then 47 non-autistic individuals. And they did an initial analysis, and they didn't find any difference between the self-identified and diagnosed autistic group, so they combined them into a single autistic group. And then they gave them a questionnaire that measured their visual mental imagery vividness. And something to keep in mind for this is that scores of less than or equal to 32 indicate the presence of aphantasia on this questionnaire. And what they found, here you can see average vividness score on the vertical axis here. And you can see that the autistic group showed lower vividness scores compared to the non-autistic group. But again, in terms of this sort of threshold for the presence of aphantasia, the means, the averages didn't go really anywhere near that. But you can still see that there were quite a few individuals from the autistic group who scored as aphantasic, and probably more than the non-autistic group. So again, they split people by whether they scored above or below this aphantasia threshold. And they found that the autistic group, surprisingly, had about a 20% prevalence of aphantasia, which is exactly mirroring the prevalence of autism in the aphantasic group of the previous study. So there seems to be this magic 20% proportion where there seems to be this overlap between autism and aphantasia. And just to compare to a general population, the prevalence of autism and aphantasia is probably between 1 and 3 or 1 and 4%. So this is a very high overlap. So there is that evidence there. So what about hyperphantasia and autism? So extremely vivid and realistic imagery. So, so far there has been no published study on the role of hyperphantasia in autism, but I'm going to present some of my own data that I've collected very recently. So I'm part of this really huge project where we asked people from around the world, 36,232 people, to self-identify as either autistic or non-autistic. And then we asked them to rate their visual mental imagery vividness on a scale from 0 to 10. And I had these cutoffs here where 0 means no mind's eye, 1 to 2 means pretty low imagery or hypophantasia. Scores between 3 and 8 was typical imagery, and then 9 to 10 was hyperphantasia. And that's usually the thresholds that people tend to use in research. And so I again split up the groups by whether they self-identified as having autism or not. And surprisingly, what we found was a higher prevalence of autism among the aphantasia and hypophantasia groups, so 9.1 and 7.7%, compared to the typical and hyperphantasic groups, which are statistically lower. So basically what we found from this very large study was that hyperphantasia was not associated with a higher prevalence of autism. However, there was a caveat. We didn't test self-identified hyperphantasics. We only asked people to rate their imagery vividness on a scale from 0 to 10, which has its own limitations. So in our latest study, and I just got this data yesterday, so I'm super excited about it, we recruited people with self-identified aphantasia, typical imagery, and hyperphantasia. And this was verified later with another imagery vividness questionnaire called the PSIQ. And we also gave them the autism quotient, but the 10-item version, a shortened version, and in which case, in the shortened version, scores greater than or equal to 6 indicate a possible presence of autism. And in this study, you can see the AQ10 sum score from 0 to 10 here on this bottom axis, and we split people into aphantasics all the way up to hyperphantasics. And what we found was that the presence of possible autism increased as people's mental imagery increased. And so basically what this showed was that there was a possible presence of autism in the self-identified hyperphantasics. And this was something like 100 hyperphantasics, but data collection is still ongoing. So it's still quite a sizable group. So in terms of the future of imagery extremes, the current definitions are really quite narrow. So most of the definitions are based on imagery vividness questionnaires. So aphantasia is typically defined as a score between 0 and 2, and hyperphantasia is defined as scores between 9 and 10 on these questionnaires. But as we are finding out, both of these constructs are actually multidimensional. So aphantasia, for example, is also associated with severely deficient autobiographical memory, which is when people are unable to retrieve memories from their childhood, for example, or important life events. People with aphantasia are also really good at being in the here and now, so they often report that they're good at learning how to clear their minds for meditation. And then they also are involved in very symbolic and abstract thinking, which it can be very challenging to verbalize and describe the type of thinking that they engage in, because it's not very concrete. Whereas hyperphantasia, we are learning currently, is associated with maladaptive daydreaming, which is daydreaming when you really shouldn't be, such as at work or driving, which can be quite unsafe. It's also associated with having a mind palace or a memory palace. So you might have seen this in Sherlock Holmes, where people can just basically file through different rooms of their house and just retrieve a memory in this very sort of visual and sensory way. And then another interesting thing that we're only just learning about is that hyperphantasics can do what I call imagery augmented reality. They can project their mental imagery into the external environment and embed it in that environment. So I always use the example of Pokemon Go. So if you've ever played Pokemon Go, basically you can see the Pokemon in your garden, for example, on your phone. So it's like embedded in the real world. Well, people with hyperphantasia can do that with their mental images. So they can turn the street outside their house into a jungle and describe it and wander through it. And it's a very pleasant experience for them. So, in terms of the future of imagery extremes, I would like to see more of this multidimensional research going on because I think that's where we're really going to start to see the truth coming out, and especially about the role of neurodiversity in these very multidimensional constructs. So thank you very much for your time. I'll just leave this slide up for another moment, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you for listening.